It is clearly taxation of working people, and these are taxes on savings generally are among the most distortionary forms of taxation.
The US is now spending more on its just interest on its national debt than it is on defence.
Even for the world's reserve currency, the possibility to borrow isn't limitless. You have to start with spending cuts, and the tax cuts have to come later.
Nobody really wants growth. We just want money for pensioners. Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here today. I'm joined by Daniel Freeman, our Managing Editor, and as always, our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. Now, we've got a bit of a theme for this week's podcast of fiscal responsibility, both at home in the UK and over the pond, where some different approaches are being taken, but arguably neither the right one. This week, the Prime Minister has indicated that he will be U-turning, to what extent we don't know, on the cut to winter fuel payments for pensioners that he announced last year and that made a big political furore. Kristian, it was a 1.5 billion measure for the Treasury, and it basically means tested winter fuel payments that went to pensioners so that millionaires won't get to them, etc., etc. But there was a huge kick-off and Labour got a drubbing in the local elections, perhaps in part because of it. But are we basically doomed if the Prime Minister, the government, can't do a relatively straightforward, we would say, cut to expenditure and benefits when we have a ballooning tax regime and an ever-expanding state, and they're having to U-turn on it? Are we stuffed?
Yes. Short summary is yes, because this should be the easy part, right? Firstly, because it's a relatively small cut in the grand scheme of things, but also because purely for electoral reasons, with Labour's electoral coalition being quite heavily biased towards younger voters, this should be easy for them. These are not their core voters anyway. If they can't do it under those circumstances, then who can, and under what circumstances? Because really, the problem with universal benefits is that they're hugely wasteful, because they go, by definition, they go to loads of people who don't need them. Okay, this one isn't completely universal because it is age contingent, but it isn't means tested, or wasn't so far. And that's the whole problem. We have lots of benefits that go to that are essentially just middle-class welfare. That is the reason why welfare spending is so large overall. If you think the welfare state should be there as a means to provide a safety net, organize some redistribution from the rich to the poor, fair enough, you can do that with a couple of % of GDP. For that, you don't need anything like a welfare state of Swedish, Belgian, French proportions. The reason why most Northern European welfare states are so large, well, and Southern European ones too nowadays, is that a lot of it is just redistribution from people at relatively similar points of the income distribution, where you redistribute from middle income earners to other middle income earners, or essentially over the course of a certain period. It means redistributing from yourself to yourself. It's the government pulling money out of your right-hand pocket, putting it into the left-hand pocket. And it's just politicians do this. There's a lot of literature on this, on fiscal illusions and so forth. Politicians like to do this because if you raise taxes in such a way that we don't really notice it, if we try to conceal them, but then hand out the money in a way that is very visible, then we all think, hooray, I'm getting free money. And we all think we're net beneficiaries, even though by definition we cannot all be net beneficiaries. Redistribution is always zero sum. And this is just fiscal trickery. And but it leads to higher government spending and to a ratchet effect over time. And it just shows how hard it is to roll back on it. And that's why universal or non-income related, non-means related benefits should ideally never been brought in to begin with. And that's also a reason why I've always been skeptical of the idea of universal basic income. Imagine, so if winter fuel payment is a relatively minor payment, imagine we had gone the whole hog at some point and or did in the future, introducing universal basic income. There is no way you would ever be able to reduce it, let alone reverse it again. Once you have a measure like that, it's always easily introduced because people see the benefits and you can bribe voters with their own money, but almost impossible to reverse.
Dan, so we spoke about quite a lot on this podcast, and generally there's a bit of a, potentially this is an optimism bias, but a bit of a sense that things are getting so bad in the country and the state isn't working, taxes are really high, that actually now would be quite a good time to do something a little bit painful, because people will accept that they have to go through that pain to get the end result. Think about the late 1970s, for example. But this suggests potentially actually we're just nobody really wants growth. We just want money for pensioners.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an interesting aspect specifically of age-related benefits, which pensions and the winter fuel payment are, which they seem to be pretty much across the world much more difficult to cut than working age benefits. So, like, even if you look at Britain, if you go back to the kind of coalition government, there were actually real cuts to working age benefits. Some people would have said they were too harsh. Some would have said, they didn't go far enough. But pensioners were, kept out of that almost entirely. And in fact, we got the triple lock, which meant that pensions are pretty much automatically going to eat up a bigger and bigger part of Britain's GDP. I think part of it is exactly what you mentioned, this idea that it's actually just evening out your earnings over your lifetime, that, I've paid in all my life and now I'm getting out. And why, after paying in all this time, why am I not, getting what I deserve? Now, we know there are a lot of problems with that in reality. One being that now we have the baby boomers, a generation that was much larger than generations before them and much larger than any generation after them. And they're living longer, and they are all getting to this stage where they're starting to be entitled to all of these programs. And also, these programs are just a lot more expensive. They're a lot more generous than they used to be. And there are far fewer younger people who are working and able to pay into this system. And because you've had basically stagnant productivity growth for the last 15 years, this all adds up. So, I mean, logically, you would say, okay, something's going to break. At some point, we're going to realize, like, this is just completely unsustainable, and that some government is going to have to row back on it. This U-turn from the current government would sort of indicate against that, in that it's not like they're doing something, really serious, like changing the triple lock to a single lock or a double lock. It is one relatively small benefit, and they even had exemptions for people on tax credit, and they've on pension credit rather, and they've still rowed back on it. We don't know how much, as you say, how much they're going to do it, like how many people are going to be eligible for winter fuel payments now, but they're not going to get as big a saving as they were hoping for.
But also, the sort of it's an interesting strategic call as well, because they've already suffered most of the political pain, you could argue. Like they've been through it. They've been battered at the local elections. They've taken the heat, and they've made the judgment that even having done all that, maybe a sunk cost fallacy, but that it's still politically the better thing to do to make the U-turn. But also, more importantly, it's the precedent they've set for the rest of their time in this parliament, that actually, if there's a big enough of a kick-off, then they did a whole big, we're going to make the tough decisions, we're going to fix the finances, fix the foundations. Yeah. But actually, they've U-turned under a heavy amount of political pressure once, despite all of their previous narrative about needing to fix the finances. So what's to say they're not just going to do it again? And certainly, it kiboshes any hopes of fundamental reform to things like the triple lock, like you mentioned, which I can't imagine will be coming down the tracks anytime soon.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, that's the whole thing with old age benefits. So Philip Booth, one of my predecessors, wrote a paper on this years ago where he showed that in an aging society, spending on the retired population goes up by more than you would expect just from demographics alone, so more than what can be explained by simply there being more of them. And he developed an empirical model for this, where he argued that the difference is in public choice incentives, that if you are a working age person, you respond to a lot of very different policy incentives. So you may care about, say, education policy if you have kids at school, infrastructure if you go to travel, or public transport if you go to work every day, and so forth. Whereas for pensioners, they are much more politically focused. They focus on one thing, which is pension policy, old age benefits. So they are much more like a political lobby, you could say. Whereas working age people, they're not really a coalition as such. We're a group that is just far too diverse. Nobody would think of us as an interest group in the conventional sense. Whereas for pensioners, so they can ignore lots of things. They can ignore education policy, public transport, whatever. So they just focus on this one thing, what happens on the old age benefit front, and they react strongly to it. And that means so in public choice terms, they are somewhere in between the large unorganizable group, consumers. Nobody can organize consumers as a political lobby. They're too large, too diverse. And an industry lobby group where you can say, right, this is maybe 1,000 people. They have one association that represents them in Westminster, Washington, wherever. Pensioners are somewhere in between. Okay, they are, of course, a diverse group. They don't see themselves as, they don't think of themselves as in terms of we're all part of the same team. But nonetheless, they respond to a smaller number of political changes, incentives, and are almost like a political lobby group now.
That's really interesting, and I think accurate. And also, the other key thing is, doesn't really matter necessarily which party they're more inclined to vote for. Historically, they are more inclined to vote at all than younger people.
Yeah.
Which makes them, again, more like a lobby group.
I think there's also an aspect, particularly in Britain, that the conception of, like, the way we think about pensioners and the sort of where pensioners are economically is kind of 30 years out of date. So if you go to, museums or restaurants, you'll still often have like, a discount pensioner option, or discount haircuts for barbers, and companies are perfectly free to do that. I don't have any objection per se to that, but I think these sort of programs, this sort of way of thinking of it, dates back to, like, if you go back to the 1990s, on average, pensioners had significantly less disposable income than working age people, which is kind of what you'd expect. But that has been reversed over the last kind of 25 to 30 years. So now, especially if you account for spending on housing, like, pensioners have significantly more disposable income than working age people. And yet our sort of the way we think about pensioners tends to be like, oh, well, they don't have much. And so therefore that I think plays some role in some of the Labour opposition to it, because Labour tends sort of think, oh, we don't want to kick the little guy. And so even if pensioners may not be a huge component of, well, they are a very significant component of Labour's voter base because they're a large group, but they're not as dominant as they are in, say, the Conservative Party or the Reform Party. It's still something that Labour kind of culturally finds quite difficult to do. Like, Labour finds it really uncomfortable to withdraw benefits, even if they're ones that, don't actually go to the people who kind of need them most.
And also it makes it more of a politically sympathetic thing to do for even people who are on working age. It's quite hard for your average person on the street, even if they're not a pensioner themselves, to those people will offer to sympathise with the pensioner anyway.
Yeah, there were IFS reports on this more than 10 years ago where they said, historically, if you look at relative poverty rates, is always among the pensioner population far larger than among the working age population. And at some point, must have been late 2000s or so, that got completely reversed. Now you have far fewer pensioners, relatively speaking, living in relative poverty, having less than 60% of median income. than the working age population. That's a complete reversal of historic patterns because, obviously, if you look at incomes over a lifetime, it always used to be the case that it's highest when you're in the prime of your earning power and then declines with age, and with pensions being a partial compensation for that, but a replacement rate that is well below 100%. And yes, it's just really not like that anymore. But somehow the mindset hasn't been updated. So it's a bit like I read about this, how somebody complained about how when you go to a care home that they play wartime music all the time. But nowadays, these people don't remember the wartime years. You have to play the Beatles maybe, or Elvis Presley.
What's the sort of the way out of this is, thinking about fiscal responsibility and how do we possibly keep, if the government isn't willing to tackle this problem, be it the sort of the general expenditure of the government or the pensioner focus specifically, then they have to find the money from somewhere. Now, Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, has this week had a memo, whatever you like to call it, letter, leaked with interesting timing, where she's recommended to the Chancellor a number of tax rises that we could do. And remembering that the government's line about not taxing working people, and is, we can debate whether they're delivering that, but they are still sticking to that as a pledge. And the note that Rayner wrote to the Chancellor outlined a lot of taxes that weren't on working people and therefore landed quite heavily on savings, effectively. A few of them, we won't run through them all in detail, but a few of them were to remove the pensions lifetime allowance, which is maybe going against our pensioner point, but we'll come back to that. Remove the pension lifetime allowance, increasing dividend taxes, raising the bank surcharge, and freezing the additional rate of tax. Kristian, what would be the impact of these things? Is this not the answer? Do we not just go and tax all of these, sort of the wealthier and the banks and dividends?
Yeah,
so we can pay the pensioners?
It's all of it, the bankers, the bonuses, So these are mostly taxes on savings, and these are then, of course, taxes on working people, just maybe not in their role as working people, but we all play different roles in economic lives, partly as workers, then as consumers, then as savers, and various other roles. And this is just taxing people in their role as savers, but it is clearly taxation of working people. And these are taxes on savings generally are among the most distortionary forms of taxation that there are. And this isn't specifically a free market perspective. This is the Merlis report. This is standard IFS, Institute for Fiscal Studies territory. Maybe nowadays they would be a bit more reluctant to say it like that, now that respectable opinion has shifted so far to the left. But this is really standard textbook economics, that taxing savings is about the worst form of taxation, the most distortionary. Now, some of there were maybe 2 or 3 proposals in that Rayner list where you could maybe justify it on the grounds that it removes special exemptions, say from inheritance tax, and one was on stamp duty, I think. But even there, it's always special exemptions or opt-outs or exemptions from taxes that ideally shouldn't exist at all, or should be much lower if they must exist. So therefore, even in those terms, not much of an improvement. So this is the worst possible way in which...
So measures to simplify aren't necessarily the worst measures of the lot, but they're still, yeah. What's your take, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, it's... In some ways, it's kind of a continuation of about the last 20 plus years of tax policy, and that you try and find these like small, 2 billion here, a billion and a half,
200 million here.
Yeah, in a way that doesn't include sort of raising the big taxes on working people. And I think, the unusual thing, right? What one of the things that has changed about the British tax system in the last 15 years is that it's actually got a lot more progressive. It's with, the IFS has written a lot on this. Daniel Needle has also done stuff on this. Is that we're in this weird situation where the top 1% of earners in one way or another, are paying a much higher share of tax in Britain than they previously were 15 years ago. And people on sort of average income, when you compare us to a lot of other European countries with sort of similar overall levels of government spending and tax, where Britain is unusual is that we have fairly low levels of tax on the average person. And so this is kind of like a plea for a continuation of that. And actually, that's what Labour's been trying to do, is basically say, oh, we're going to spend a lot more money on, you know, higher wages for public sector workers and more investment in capital investments in the public sector. But we're going to try and avoid, you know, raising any of the big taxes that actually raise loads of money. And that's basically income tax, VAT, and okay, national insurance, but they still raise that in a way that doesn't appear, you know, it doesn't appear directly on your in terms of lower income. It just means, you know, companies will probably hire fewer people and wages will increase less in the private sector anyway.
Indeed. But I guess so let's now move ourselves over to the other side of the Atlantic, because on one hand, what the Labour government are doing in the UK is more tax and spend, whereas the Republicans and Trump across the pond are doing more spend but less tax and just driving up the deficit. So that big, what Trump's called it, is big, beautiful bill, I believe, that he's introduced this week. And that has it extends a lot of the tax cuts from 2017 and goes further. There's quite a lot of going back to the point about simplification being a good thing. He sort of goes the opposite way, makes the tax system quite a lot more complex, tax breaks for things like US cars, for example. But also on top of that, loads of spending. So billions going on finishing this border wall and lots of other immigration measures, billions on defence, and those sort of classic Republican things, if you like. He says the claim is that they're going to claw some of that back through cuts to Medicaid and elsewhere. But actually, sort of analysis shows the deficit over the next decade going up quite dramatically. Dan, I'll turn to you first. What is this a better approach, just to go for the lower taxes and then just travel up the deficit and we'll fund it that way?
No, it's well, I mean, so I think the US got very comfortable over the 2010s with the idea that you could run up really big deficits and it will be basically fine because interest rates are just sort of always going to remain really low. So it doesn't actually, it's basically free money. You sometimes got people at the time, mostly on the left, saying we should be, running massive deficit, even bigger deficits now to invest in, the Green New Deal or whatever sort of hobby horse they had at the time. And especially since sort of 2020 and COVID hit, US spending has gone up a lot. The Biden's Inflation Reduction Act involves spending about 1.2 trillion additional dollars. And this is probably, if you take the big beautiful bill overall, it's probably going to increase, and it's going to be a net increase in US government spending of somewhere between $2.5 trillion and $5 trillion over the next decade, which is an awful lot. $2.5 trillion is about the size of the UK's economy. And it's also significant because we're not really in a world of like super low interest rates. Like the US is now spending more on its just interest on its national debt than it is on defense. It's spending like roughly the equivalent of the economy of Israel just on paying off the interest on its debt. So this is going to likely make this, well, this issue worse, especially when you've got a broader economic context and a broader political context of, the Trump administration changing its position on tariffs every couple of weeks. That's probably going to be a fairly significant disincentive for investment in the US, probably reduces consumer and business confidence. So all of this together doesn't strike me as being particularly responsible.
No, it's essentially the mini budget writ large. It's essentially a form of naive Lafferism, I believe, that that tax cuts pay for themselves, which isn't even what Laffer said. He said there could be a self-financing element of it, but that doesn't mean that you can just cut taxes whenever you want and that you don't have to worry about the spending side. So that's not even what Arthur Laffer himself would say. It's a really a kind of exaggerated Lafferism, which would only work if on some specific tax you are on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. So if the tax rate is so high that you're suppressing economic activity to such an extent that you're probably better off cutting it, okay, but that's not really what's happening here. And even if you believe in that kind of naive Lafferism, you wouldn't do it in the way Trump is doing things now, because if you look at some of his tax cuts, so one of them is on pensioners, where he's raising the US equivalent of the personal allowance, the tax-free threshold. He's raising that for pensioners. Well, okay, but they are outside of the labor force, so they're not going to react with an increase in labor supply. And the other one is making tips in the hospitality industry, making them tax exempt. Okay, that's not going to trigger an expansion of labor supply. You might get friendlier service in some restaurants, but again, even if you're a pure Lafferite, I don't think Laffer would approve of that way of doing things. So and then you have all that, and then he also wants to increase spending on a lot of the things that Republicans like, border enforcement in particular, and deporting people, and that costs money, and defense.
I want to pick up actually on that, on the don't tax tips thing, because I think in some ways that shows that the problem isn't just Trump. It's kind of the US political system more broadly, because this the bill specifically going through on exempting up to $25,000 worth of tips from any tax was passed unanimously in the Senate. Like, every single senator voted for it. Also, in the presidential election, both Trump and Kamala Harris said, yeah, we support this. Now, it's a really, really bad policy for a series of reasons. One, it's just creating loads of bad incentives to try and, skew your, evade tax, basically.
But more,
yeah. But it's also, it seems to act against one of the other big agendas of Trump's sort of economic industrial policy, if you want to think of it like that, which is that, the American economy has shifted too much towards the service sector. We need to put people into manufacturing. But this is actually a massive, massive tax cut, essentially a different rate of tax if you happen to work in highly tipped industries like the hospitality, and not if you're working in a factory. And there's absolutely no good reason I can see for why the US government should essentially be subsidizing people to work in restaurants, and rather than people on a similar income working in a factory or some other sector, agriculture, whatever, where it isn't customary for people to tip you. It wouldn't really be possible for tipping. It's just a really stupid policy, but it has almost universal acclaim across American politics.
Well, maybe somebody will come up with a way of declaring parts of salaries as a tip, saying, okay, you get a really low base rate salary, but you get lots of tips, and then find a way of trying to make that tax.
So it does have to be in cash. That's one of the. I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm very happy to take tips for any IEA papers I write, or any, if anyone wants to send me wads of cash, please do. Who ships you?
I wonder if it's a good example of how the most visible taxes are the ones that get the sort of most downward pressure on them politically. We still see it with council tax in the UK, because you actually have to pay a council tax bill rather than it being taken off your paycheck. So it feels unjust that somebody hands me a tenner for doing a good job, and I've got to I only get £6 of that or whatever. So that is therefore that feels so unfair that it creates a place where you've got a unanimous decision to cut those.
Yeah, but that's why ideally all taxes should be like that. All taxes should be like council tax, because that's the most visible tax, and you would get very different political incentives if you had the money first and then you had to make the transfer, and then you would realize, wait, well, what am I paying all this for? It would be psychologically very different. So there was a book on this more than 100 years ago. I think I mentioned it on the podcast. An Italian proto-public choice economist, Amilcare Poviani, who wrote about the Fiscal Illusion and how a lot of taxes are designed in such a way that you don't really notice them. They merge with something else, with a consumer price, or they're disguised as inflation or as a suppressed wage increase in the future and all that. And therefore, it feels to us as if we pay much less than we actually do pay. And that's why you get a constant demand for more and more government spending. But if we had a realistic idea of how much we actually pay in taxes, you will get very different political incentives.
Yeah. I suppose this is why governments in Britain seem to love putting levies on things, because virtually no one sees a levy as something they pay, but it's something they indirectly end up paying through higher prices.
Yep, bang on. Let's just take it back to the tax and spend narrative of the entire discussion we're having here. This bill will rank up huge deficits, and you said it's the mini budget writ large. So how are they getting away with it in America? Because if we try to do that here, it would be carnage. No, what's the difference?
Well, for a while at least, America used to get away with much higher deficits than pretty much anyone else, just by being the holder or the issuer of the world's reserve currency. That there is always going to be a demand for financial instruments that are dollar denominated, because even if you don't have enough domestic savers, bond holders domestically, someone somewhere will want to own US government bonds because it's in dollars, and that's a currency that you can use pretty much anywhere, that even if you're never going to buy American goods or services with them, it's just accepted elsewhere that you have lots of semi-dollarized economies. And in that way, it seemed that there's just an infinite demand for US dollars, and therefore they could get away with a level of borrowing where if you're a smaller country, you just couldn't do it. But even there, we're seeing limits. So now we have seen an increase in risk premiums that bondholders are demanding. So even for the world's reserve currency, the possibility to borrow isn't limitless. So
they'll run out of road eventually anyway. Now, so we looked at the UK's high tax, high spend, the US's approach of low tax, high spend. What would be the IEA approach, Kristian? A free market approach?
Well, there have been several IEA books on this. Last one when was it, 2017 or so? The book on taxation and growth, where the authors there was a multi-authored publication where they all were quite clear that you can't start with tax cuts. You have to start with spending cuts, and the tax cuts have to come later. That was essentially also the Lawson approach in the 80s. And Laffer effects, all well and good, they may exist, but you can't bank on them. You don't know how big they're going to be or when they will materialize. You need to address the spending side first, and the taxation side will then more or less take care of itself. And that was implicitly, at least, that book was in opposition to this, what's always been popular among some American conservatives, which is the starve the beast philosophy, the idea that just cut taxes now, and then there will be political pressure to reduce spending later. But it just doesn't quite work out that way, and even less, of course, in a smaller country. So that's why the mini budget ran up against the limits of that philosophy, and so the only element of it that could maybe work a little bit would be so Trump also has this idea to bring in or strengthen work requirements for recipients of Medicaid, the Poor People's Health Insurer, and food stamps. And okay, that's where he has a slightly stronger case than the rest of the big beautiful bill, because that was essentially the Clinton agenda in the 90s, where they just brought in work requirements for a lot of benefits and did so conditionality, workfare, and did increase employment in that way, telling people, look, you will get support, but you have to do something for it. You either have to accept a job offer if you can get one, or you have to take part in various, say, supervised job search activities or whatever. And that was successful at the time, Clinton era, 90s. It's just with the pandemic that all those work requirements were just, not all of them, but they were largely rolled back, suspended, and that agenda got derailed.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd also say, so obviously there's a big difference between the US and Britain or other European economies, because the US has the dollar and we do not. But there is also an element of the US actually, at least up until now, over the last 10 plus years, has had an economy that's been really rapidly growing, or at least it's been growing at sort of roughly its pre-financial crisis trend rate, whereas Britain, like a lot of Western European economies, has not had that. We have had, we had the hit from the financial crisis, and then since then we have been growing at a much, much slower rate. So if Britain had consistently, GDP per capita growth rates of like 2.5% for most of the last decade, you probably could get away with some, more tax cuts, or if you're on the Labour side, sort of more state spending. But when you have an economy that is essentially stagnant, markets are going to be a lot less willing to sort of cut you slack when it comes to, trust us, guys, it's going to lead to growth later on. Well, people are going to be understandably skeptical of that.
So it all comes back to economic growth, which is sort of our entire philosophy here. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for, but thank you very much for joining us. As always, go and check us out on Substack, insider.iea.org.uk, so you don't miss any of our output. And until next time, thank you very much.